Many of our teenagers and young adults are being turned away from the truth and beauty of the Catholic faith by their friends and their professors who are telling them that belief in God are for people who believe in fairy tales. We're going to be talking about one of the most pervasive cancers in our culture today, and that is atheism, or the belief that there is no God. Now, why is this important to us as Catholics? Very simply this: many of our teenagers and young adults are being turned away from the truth and beauty of the Catholic faith by their friends and their professors who are telling them that belief in God are for people who believe in fairy tales. That unless you can see, taste, touch, measure, or quantify something, then it's not real. And this kind of thinking are turning our children away from belief in the one God, the one true God, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. That same God who sent his Son, our Lord Jesus Christ, the Word became flesh, so that he could share his life with us. Their hearts are being turned away from things of the faith and turned inward toward themselves. Because after all, if there is no God, if there is no natural moral law, if there is no absolute truth, then you can live your life basically however you want. Because nothing that guides us and that governs human existence applies to you. So how big is this problem? I remember that I had an opportunity to speak with Dr. Scott Hahn at a men's conference. And I thanked him for his book that he wrote with Dr. Benjamin Weicker, tackling the new atheism. And I asked him, why did he write that book? Was he just going to kind of contribute to the Christian kind of defense of faith in God? And he told me that the reason that he co-authored that book was that there were Steubenville graduates, where he teaches at the University of Steubenville in Ohio. Steubenville graduates who were questioning their faith because of Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion. And I was stunned. So I'm thinking to myself, wow, if even someone who goes to a university like that can start to question their faith, imagine many of our young people today and where they must be at in their faith, questioning, and especially during a time when they're teenagers, where there's this natural tendency to separate from your parents as they establish their own identity. So adding fuel to that whole natural separation from your parents, kind of setting up their own independent way of thinking, is this atheism that's now in the mix, and that's turning them away even faster from the love of God. So what I'd like to do is to kind of break this up into several different parts. First of all, to talk about what is atheism, the development of atheism, talk about some of its main characteristics and features of this neo or new atheism that we're experiencing in our culture today, how they deliver that message, and then most importantly, where I'm going to spend the bulk of the time, is how Catholics respond to atheism while defending the beauty and truth of our faith. So let us begin. I'd like to start with a quote from the Bible from 2 Timothy 4, verses 2 to 5. And I think this is very prevalent today that St. Paul is writing to Timothy, and this same message is very relevant to us today. He says it in 2 Timothy 4, verses 2 to 5. Preach the word. Be urgent in season and out of season. Convince, rebuke, and exhort. Be unfailing in patience and teaching. For the time is coming when people will not endure sound teaching, and having itching ears, they will accumulate for themselves teachers to suit their own liking, and will turn away from listening to the truth and wander into myths. And that's exactly what's happened with this new atheism that's so pervasive in our culture today. So I want to define a few terms because I'm going to be using some terms throughout the presentation. And so I want to define them so you can be familiar with what I'm talking about. First one, obviously, is the word atheism itself. It comes from a Greek word, atheos, which means without God. So basically, atheism believes that not only that there isn't a God, the understanding of the Christian God as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, but that there is no deities at all. So for whether you're Jew or Muslim or Hindu or Buddhist, where there's a transcendence or an energy or anything like that, they wouldn't believe in any of those kinds of things. That there is no supernatural. There is no ontological. There is no essence and being and nature of things. There's no external outside of the self and what we can measure and quantify. There's also theism, which is the opposite of atheism. And theism believes that there is a God and that this God is personal. He's present. He's active in the world and in our lives and in the universe. The third word is deism. And deism contends that there is a God, that he's transcendent and supreme, but he does not intervene in the natural world and really has no interest in us. Sometimes deism, the deist believes in what's called the watchmaker God. And this is a God who basically creates the universe and winds it up like a watch or a clock and kind of sets it off and lets it run. And then he goes off and does something else and really doesn't have any interest in his creation. That's the deist or deism. So I wanted to be clear about those three terms because they're going to be important. Now, if we trace the roots of atheism, and actually wasn't called formally atheism until about the 17th century or so. But the idea that people believe that there was not a God goes all the way back to ancient Israel. For example, we see in Psalm 14, they wrote, "The fool has said in his heart, there is no God above." So we know, of course, that the Israelites were surrounded by tribes and nations that were pagan, that did not believe in God or believed in many gods or didn't believe in the God of Israel, whatever. But there were also people that did not believe in God at all. And this is what the psalmist is referring to in Psalm 14. But also in the pagan world, atheism was not unknown, primarily through a guy named Epicurus. And he developed a line of thinking named after him called Epicureanism. Okay? Here's how it works. The purpose of philosophy was to attain happiness and a tranquil life, being joyful and peaceful, freedom from fear and anxiety, absence of pain, and living self-sufficiently surrounded by your friends. That's what life is all about. Pleasure and pain determines what is good and what is evil. So the more you do things that are pleasurable, those things are good. But if there were things that brought you pain, then those things were evil. And since there was, after death, there's no supernatural, there's no afterlife, then body and soul, therefore, the dichotomy between them was not to be feared. So there's no connection between body and soul because after death, that's it. That's the end. They were convinced that, again, if something had to be measured or observed or quantified in order for it to be real. The material world, therefore, was the extent of existence. It's a worldview that excludes, again, the supernatural and the metaphysical, that which is above the physical realm. So this was a very popular way of thinking. One interesting thing to note, though, was that in the Greek world, it was atheism was considered dangerous, and any person who did not support the fact that, remember, Caesar himself was considered a god. Because of the connection between Caesar and himself, considering himself a deity, and he was also the ruler of the state, anyone that was accused of being atheism, they were executed. It was a capital crime back in the time of the ancient world, precisely because if you did not believe in a god, then therefore you couldn't believe that Caesar was a god and all that kind of stuff. So it's very interesting. Now, as atheism developed over the years, we see that for the first basically 17 centuries of the Christian era, it was not a prevalent way of thinking at all. The prime mover or first cause of all things was the prominent way of thinking. And then what changed was in the 18th century, atheism developed out of the spread of the Enlightenment. And then by the 19th century, we see that atheism begins to be a more dominant philosophy and way of thinking, and basically branched off into two schools of thought. The first branch being what's called theoretical atheism. All right, so theoretical atheism is the type of atheism that's being taught today in colleges and universities and things like that. It's based on a system of thought where there, again, is no God, there's no supernatural, no omnipotent designer and maker of anything. Again, this is being pushed academically. Some of the famous theoretical atheists include Ludwig Feuerbach, Sigmund Freud, Karl Marx, and Darwin, the famous evolution guy. There were also a school called of practical atheism. Basically, you organize your life and you live your life around the assumption that there is no God. And this is the root, this practical or cultural atheism is the roots and foundation of moral relativism that we see today. Since there is no natural law and there is no objective truth. So truth becomes whatever I decide it to be. Some of the famous cultural or practical atheists include Friedrich Nietzsche, Gene Roddenberry, and if that name sounds familiar, that's the guy who created Star Trek. So very interesting. And also Isaac Asimov were some of the famous practical atheists. So how did atheism then become popular out of these two schools? Well, again, prior to in the first 17 centuries, the predominant thought was, as regard to the natural order of things, there was kind of a classical school of thinking when it came to the natural order. And this was the teaching, of course, of Plato, of Aristotle, and then for us as Catholics, Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas. And this classical way of thinking about the world had two schools of thought, or two branches. Now, the names are a little bit technical, but I'll explain them. The first one they talked about was a teleological understanding. Teleological understanding. So in other words, the universe has a design, it has a purpose, and it has an ultimate end. There is a reason why we are here. There is a purpose and a meaning for the universe, the way it's created, how it's created, why you are here, and the gift that you contribute of your life while you are here on earth. There is a meaning for that. It's called a teleological understanding. The next one was called an essentialist understanding as well, that objects can be understood and discerned by their essences. And that's a little technical. Let me explain what that means. If I were to say the word dog, right now, all of you just formed an image in your mind of a dog. Now, each of the images that you just formed in your mind, it may be a small dog, a big dog, it might be a Shiatsu, it might be a Dachshund, it might be it might be an Akita, it might be a German Shepherd, but everyone formed a picture in their mind. When I said dog, you formed a picture in your mind of exactly what I was talking about. Now, you actually didn't see, taste, touch, measure a dog, but the reality of what dog is exists in your mind. So that is, in a sense, this essentialist position that you can take abstract concepts and make them real, okay? So that's the understanding there, that reality can be known through the use of universal or abstract concepts, okay? The idea of dogness that you formed in your mind. Now, this is opposed to, again, after in the 18th century, in the post-Enlightenment period, we see that atheists started to develop what's called a mechanical view of the world, or a mechanistic view of the world, based on the thinking of philosophers like Hobbes, Locke, Descartes, Hume, and Sartre. They said that things don't have essences, that the world of common sense, that again, things that we can see, tables, chairs, dogs, rocks, human beings, they are not objectively there. So the essence of humanness or dogness doesn't exist in the natural world. So when I use that example of a dog, you form the dog in your mind, they would say that that is not real. That you're being able to do that is actually not real because there is no dog there. So what is present is meaningless particles that are in motion. And the differences that we take to be absolute, in other words, we would say there's an absolute difference between a table and between a baby and between this cell phone or between the Bible. There are differences between these things. There are absolute differences between them. This mechanical sense of the universe would say that that is not true. All those are different arrangements of meaningless moving particles. What we perceive to be the essence of nature of something is really not there. They're just projections onto the human mind. And there is no function, therefore, or meaning or purpose in the world. This is mechanical view that atheism began to develop out of the post-Enlightenment period in the 18th century. Now, if we fast forward to the 20th century, we'll see a different type of atheist in the early 20th century than what we see now. Back in the 20th century, there were guys like, for example, Anthony Flew. He criticized the idea of life after death, that we had free will, that God was meaningless. So that was kind of the classical thing. But the thing is, those kinds of philosophers were open to hearing philosophical and theological positions and debates. So they were open to hearing the thoughts of philosophy and theology when it came to an understanding of the essences of things, especially the existence of God. Now you juxtapose that or put that next to the contemporary atheists of today. And when I mean contemporary atheists, I mean those guys who are often referred to as the four horsemen of atheism. I'm talking about Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris, and the late Christopher Hitchens. And sometimes now, because of the death of Christopher Hitchens, sometimes Stephen Hawking is mentioned now in those group of men. Now, not only do they say that there is no God, they say that any religious view that purports a belief in God should not be tolerated, and in fact should be criticized and exposed as irrational. They have absolutely no interest whatsoever in looking at philosophy or theology as arguments for proof of the existence of God. They are not interested in looking at any of that at all. They argue that naturalism, or the idea that there is laws in nature and in the universe, for example, gravity, the speed of light, those things can help us determine the cause of things, rather than to say that there is a God, this theistic God who loves us and has a purpose, this teleological purpose and meaning for us and the universe. They said just by looking at the natural laws themselves will help us to explain everything. So how do I characterize this neo or new atheism? Again, the type of atheism that many of our young people are exposed to today? Well, I would say there are four basic characteristics. The first one is that they exhibit an arrogant intellectualism. What do I mean by that? Modern intellectual life has become extremely specialized. You know, so say that you have someone who gets their doctorate in physics. Well, it's not just a doctorate in physics. You know, they have specializations now. For example, it might be particle physics. And even a subdiscipline under particle physics may be an area of specialization for this particular scientist. And so this broad thinking has become narrower as modern intellectual life has begun to develop. And this has allowed some of these men, again, not all, but some of them, to become intellectually dishonest and shallow. For example, now I'm not taking anything away from the fact that these are extremely intelligent individuals. They know their stuff, and you know, and actually, I think that's a good thing that they're considered experts in their fields, and that's wonderful. I mean, Daniel Dennett is an analytical philosopher with interests in evolutionary biology and cognitive science. Dawkins is an evolutionary biologist. Sam Harris is a neuroscientist. The late Christopher Hitchens was a journalist. And Stephen Hawking is a theoretical physicist and cosmologist. So these guys are really smart. I'm not taking anything away from that. But what they do is they take serious thinkers in the areas of philosophy and theology, like Aquinas and Augustine, and they caricature them. And rather than criticizing or analyzing their arguments, they just completely ignore them, make fun of them, and dismiss them. That's the difference. You see, the 20th century atheists would have engaged Augustine, would have engaged Aquinas. But instead, these guys completely ignore them, in fact, mock them and make fun of them. They are trapped, I believe, in this prison of circular reasoning, that other fields outside of their own disciplines are worthless. If it's not science, then it's not worth knowing about. So their conclusion then that I draw is that atheism then, the results of their philosophical interpretation gets confused with actually doing science. Because after all, what discoveries have atheists made? What real contribution to science and technology have atheists made? I can't think of any. Number two, I believe that these neo-atheists or new atheists are vincibly ignorant. In other words, they will or choose to be ignorant. The idea of the existence of a deity or of a God is part of the natural moral law. We see this in Romans chapter 1 and chapter 2 from St. Paul. The fundamental and intrinsic principle of the natural law is to do good and avoid evil, and the conscience is the practical application of that fundamental principle. So for atheists, serious moral dilemmas cause them to seek a way out of a properly formed conscience. See, their conscience is not formed in accord with the objective truth of the natural law. Consequently, they deliberately form their consciences away from objective truth. So instead of going down a path that may lead them to an understanding of what is objectively true, they choose to stay exactly where they are in their thinking, and thus they become vincibly or willed ignorance. Thirdly, they are polemic historians. In other words, atheists have a slanted and skewed view of history and Western civilization. We're actually going to be looking at that. They're not willing to investigate the true facts about the Crusades or about Galileo or about the Inquisition. And we'll be looking at two of those. We'll be looking at the Crusades and the Inquisition as examples of exactly what I'm talking about here. Many atheists rely on black legend that was created to discredit the church instead of looking at the actual facts about what happened in those two historical events. Finally, the fourth characteristic, there are excellent rhetoricians. So they say things, for example, like religion is dangerous because it is used by a tool or as a tool by people to wield control over others and advance their own agendas, saying that God gives me approval for my actions. Or they say that atheism is for the intelligentsia and belief in God is for the weak-minded. Peter Singer, who is a ethicist out of Princeton University, once said, it would be more ethical to kill a newborn human baby than to kill a pig because pigs are smarter. So it would be more ethical to kill a child than to kill a pig because pigs are smarter. He says value is determined by the level of intelligence. So the more intelligent you are, the more valuable you are as a person. It has nothing to do with the fact that of your personality or who you are. The more intelligent you are, the more valuable you are. And we'll return to him a little bit later in this presentation as well to hear what he has to say about children, for example, with Down syndrome. Another one of their sayings that they like to say is, I'm an atheist so I can be a better person. I don't need a holy book or a man in the sky to tell me what to do. I am free to be a good person out of the kindness of my heart. And why is that? It goes back to that Epicurean way of thinking. The justification is it benefits everyone to be peaceful and happy. And how do they deliver this message? And deliver it very effectively. Obviously, they use all their modern forms of communication. Print media, through their books and articles, through television, which seems to be fostering more and more of an atheist way of thinking in its programming. And a lot of the television shows that we see now very much cast this atheist agenda. For them, faith is a virus, it's a mutation, it's a psychosis to believe in God. But it's very interesting, though, that even some of the contemporaries of Richard Dawkins, for example, are kind of moving away from his kind of thought. Why do atheists want to do away with God? The thing is, if you have a God, then you have to be held accountable to a higher standard. If you believe that there is a God, then you can't do whatever you want to do. Because, the thing is, I want to do whatever I want to do as long as I don't hurt anybody. Well, who decides what it means to hurt anybody? You do. And so there is no, then, law that governs things. People just do whatever they want to do. And they think that that's what freedom is. That's why one of the reasons why they have to do away with God. But we'll see, that when they try to make this position, as Dawkins tries to do that, some of his contemporaries even have moved away from the direction that he's moving in with atheism. So when we will continue the program, what we'll do now, we'll start to look at the arguments that some atheists will make, and then what the Catholic response should be to those positions that are held by atheists. How do we respond to them in our Catholic faith in a charitable but yet effective way? So how should Catholics respond to atheism while defending the beauty and truth of the faith? So what I'd like to do now is take some of the major arguments against the belief in God and to show what the Catholic response to them should be. So, proposition number one by the atheists: science and religion are incompatible. Science is for the intelligent and faith is for the weak-minded. So I would say we would have two responses to that. First of all, scientists who laid the foundation for modern science, were almost all deeply religious men. And it was their work in uncovering the laws of the universe that led them to this conclusion. I'll just give you two examples. The first one is Albert Einstein, who was a deist. Now, Einstein believed that his theory of relativity was divine inspiration. He said that God does not play dice with the universe, that the universe doesn't just come about by chance. He said that science without religion is lame, and religion without science is blind. So he talks about actually not that they're incompatible, but that there is necessarily a compatibility, a relationship between science and religion. He says that there remains something subtle, intangible, that means you can't touch it, that's inexplicable, can't be explained. He said veneration of this force, of this subtle, intangible, inexplicable force beyond anything that we can comprehend is my religion. See? So, of course, by making a statement like that, we can clearly see that he was a deist that didn't believe in a personal God. But see how powerful his statements are. That he attributed his discoveries to an intelligent being. So Einstein, who clearly was the greatest scientist of the 20th century, came to the conclusion from his incredible discoveries that there is an intelligent universe, intelligent God behind everything that helped create the universe. The second example is someone that I mentioned before, Anthony Flew, who was an atheist in the 20th century as well, later 20th century after Einstein. He came to the conclusion, he also became a deist, and also concluded that a deity, or a super intelligence as he called it, is the only good explanation for the origin of life and the complexity of nature. See, so once again, although he did not believe in God, he was open to hearing philosophical and theological arguments. And as he examined everything and as a whole, again, not the arrogant intellectualism, not the vincible ignorance of saying, well, I refuse to look at those arguments that may lead me to truth, because that's what science should really be heading us toward, looking for truth. The fullness of truth, wherever that truth may exist. And when Anthony Flew began to do that, he also became a deist and drew the conclusion that there has to be a super intelligence that is the only good explanation for the origin of life and all the complexities that we see in nature. And we'll be looking at a few of those in a little later as well. Proposition number 2 is that science explains everything from the beginning of the universe to our emotions. So science can explain everything that we see within us as human beings and in the universe. Well, I would say a couple of points on this. I would say make 3 points in the Catholic response. First of all, science cannot explain consciousness. There are, for example, if I talked about, I said I have a heart, okay? Fine. You can look at the heart, you can see it, there are cells that make up the heart, or my liver, or my kidney, or there's blood cells, or there's hair cells. You know, you can see, taste, touch, measure, and quantify that. So it's real. But what about consciousness? Now, you can measure consciousness. For example, you can put an electroencephalogram on someone's head, and it can measure brain waves. And a scientist, by looking at those waves, can see whether someone is awake or someone is asleep, whether they're conscious or unconscious. That's fine. You can measure that. But there are no consciousness cells in the brain. There's no size or shape or weight or depth. There's no characteristics of physical objects that other body parts have that are created with cells. There's nothing like that for consciousness. Second of all, that doesn't explain, the atheist cannot explain the origins of conceptual thought. So for example, we talked before about the idea of the dog, right? And you form the idea of a dog in your mind. And how they say that that's not real because basically it has no physicalness to it. You can't see, taste, touch, measure, or quantify. Now, that's very interesting. And actually, as a little bit of a side note, this is interesting because a thought that came out of this was something called nominalism, right? And nominalism basically said that objects or things reality cannot be known through the use of universal and abstract concepts like the doggedness or the idea of the dog in your mind, but only through the empirical study of specific individual objects. So you can only really know that there is a dog if you see a dog in front of you that you can touch and measure and quantify. Now, what are the implications of nominalism as far as the Catholic Church is concerned? Think about, for example, the Eucharist, right? St. Thomas Aquinas taught about borrowing language from philosophy from Aristotle, talked about substance and accidents. So what we teach is what? The Eucharist, the bread and the wine that become the body and blood, soul, divinity of Jesus, that the nature, the essence of what that bread and wine is, after the transubstantiation changes into the body and blood, soul, divinity of Jesus, but yet the accidents, the fact that it still looks like bread and tastes like bread and looks like wine and tastes like wine, it has the effects of wine on the body, that those accidents still remain. Now, very interesting. If you think about, for example, Luther and all the other ones, who I believe Luther was a student of nominalism. So you can see how this idea then develops that, for our Protestant brothers and sisters, where the Eucharist is not the body and blood, soul, divinity of Jesus, right? That it's just bread and wine. Although there are variations on this trans-signification that the Eucharist only signifies the body and blood of Christ, or only stays the body and blood of Christ during the actual liturgical ceremony, but then after it goes back to being bread and wine, all kinds of things. So you can see the implications of this kind of thought about things having essences and natures and beings when it comes to an understanding what the most deeply held belief that we have as Catholics in the Eucharist as actually the real substantial presence of God under the species of bread and wine. It is truly God, body and blood, soul, divinity. The next thing that it can't explain, besides conceptual thought and also consciousness, is the self. I mean, think about it for a second. Every molecule that comprises the neurons in our brains changes thousands of times during our lifetime. Nothing remains the same in your brain. Every cell in your body changes every 7 years. Yet you're the same person you are now when you were a baby or whether you're 80 years old. You're still the same person. Now, my dad, for example, and I've talked about him in the past, he loved womenizing and alcohol and cigarettes. But now he's on fire for Jesus Christ. He completely changed his life around. But if you took a blood sample from him from 30 years ago and you take a blood sample from him now, it would show that it is the same person. But when you talk with my dad, when you see the perspective that he has now on life, he is not the same person. See, and the thing is, science cannot explain that. Science doesn't explain how we have art or music and why those things are, because remember, that's conceptual thought. Yeah, you take an instrument and play, but to come up with a concerto that Mozart may have come up with, or to come up with a beautiful score of music that Beethoven did, or to be able to design a computer, looking at a typewriter and using the same basic keyboard arrangement on the typewriter, and then carrying that forward into computer technology. What about linguistics and language development? It cannot be explained purely by science. Right now, I'm speaking to you. Where do we get this first person perspective from? There's no organ in the brain that performs understanding. I mean, right now, I'm speaking to you, and the neurons in my brain are firing and being active, but they're not telling me what to say to you right now. The neurons are not controlling me and saying, okay, Deacon, say this next. That's not how it works. So atheism cannot explain many of these things that we do see in natural science that can't be necessarily measured or quantified. And the important thing for me also, that science cannot explain why. You know, so many people in their life are searching to know why. Why are we here? Why do I exist? What is my purpose? Why did this happen to me? And say, well, just because a random group of particles and stuff just ran into you and that's what just happened. I mean, that doesn't explain it. That doesn't cut it. You know, there are realities here that just cannot be explained by scientific experimentation, which is completely ignored in the scientific field for atheists. Another atheist proposition is an argument from chance. Basically, and Dawkins talks about this in the godless delusion, or in the God delusion rather, that the universe is just brought about by chance. So he can't say that things are impossible, but that all things are probable no matter how small the possibility. So for example, if there was a statue of the Blessed Virgin Mary that was in your parish hall, and all of a sudden you saw that statue jump off the pedestal and run around the floor, we would say, well, wow, I mean, well, you think about that, you say, well, that's impossible. Well, Dawkins would say, well, that's not impossible, it's only highly improbable. As ridiculous as that sounds, that's the argument. In fact, in his book, he has a calculation for the cow jumping over the moon. And there's some kind of number that he has in there that shows the possibility of that actually happening, which is one of the smallest numbers I've ever seen. But again, he has to do that. Here's why. Look at the Catholic response. See, chance is not a cause that produces an effect. You see, in science, you know, what you measure, okay, you're doing an experiment. You say, okay, I see this result. And what I must do is do experiments to find a cause that produces this intended effect that I want to see. Well, when you extrapolate that to the universe and the cause of the origins of everything, chance is not a cause that produces an effect. Secondly, Dawkins is trying to redefine miracles out of existence, because if you say that there are some things that are impossible but yet still happen, then you would have to say that there's a miracle, which automatically means that you have to say that there's some kind of supernatural, which then opens the door to belief in God. So that door has to be slammed shut with a ridiculous argument that not all things are impossible, only highly improbable. It's ridiculous. I mean, it's just some things that are just completely impossible, like a cow jumping over a moon, like a statue jumping off and running around the room. But to say that that could happen by molecules rearranging themselves is not, improbable. It's ridiculous and insulting. Third, chance doesn't explain the origins of life. Evolution talks about a life form moving from one stage of development to another, from transitioning from one form to another. But it doesn't tell us how we got life in the first place. For example, Dinesh D'Souza, in one of his debates, talks about the cell. And there's a couple of scientists, I think Franklin Harold at the University of Colorado, describes the cell as a supercomputer. And even Richard Dawkins describes, in his work, describes the cell as a kind of a digital computer. Now, the cell can't have evolved in an evolutionary process, because evolution presupposes the existence of a cell. So then where do we get the cell from? And Dinesh D'Souza says, the very idea that random molecules in a warm pond through a bolt of lightning assembled a cell would be akin to saying a bolt of lightning in a warm pond could assemble an automobile or skyscraper, right? Which makes perfect sense. It's preposterous. And so Richard Dawkins knows it's preposterous, and Dinesh D'Souza goes on to say, and therefore when asked, how did we get life originally? He said, well, maybe aliens brought it from another planet. There it is. Another argument is that we can use is the anthropic principle of a fine-tuned universe. So let me explain what that means. The anthropic principle of fine-tuned universe. So evolution depends on constants within nature. So for example, the distance of the Earth from the sun is, 8 light minutes away. And that's a constant. The speed of light, therefore, is a constant. Gravity, if I take a pencil and drop it to the ground, and I do it again and again and again, there's a constant there because gravity is a constant. The rate of expansion of the universe is a constant. There are hundreds of constants in the universe. And even Stephen Hawking, in his book, A Brief History of Time, addresses this. What if any of those constants were changed? And he talks about in the book that if the constants were changed not by 10% and not by even 1%, but if any of those constants of the universe were changed by 1 part in 100,000th millionth million, we would have no universe, we would have no life. Not just Homo sapien life, no life at all in the universe. If 1 part in 100,000th millionth million was changed in any of the constants in the universe. In other words, our existence depends on fine-tuned set of constants in the universe. So that doesn't come about just by chance. And the way they have to explain how that came about is using multi-universe theory, which I'm going to address now. So basically, multi-universe theory was developed in about 1895 by an American philosopher and psychologist named William James. In fact, we talked before about Gene Roddenberry, the founder, the creator of Star Trek. And notice how in some of the episodes, even in the modern versions of Star Trek, there are parallel universes, other realities, other dimensions. That is an offshoot of this multi-universe theory. So basically, multi-universe theory says that because of this anthropic principle of a fine-tuned universe, they compare it to like a deck of cards. So say, for example, you have a deck of cards, you're playing poker. It's highly improbable that on the first deal, you will be dealt a royal flush. King, a jack, king, queen, a 10 jack, queen, king, ace, all in the same hand. It's highly improbable you get that on the first deal. In fact, if the combination is 4 and 2.598 million possibilities of a unique 5-card draw in any of the suits on the first deal. And that drops down to 1 in 649,740. But every successive deal, the more hands you play, the odds of at least one of those hands being a royal flush increases, which makes sense. So you bring that or extrapolate that into multi-universe theory. If the odds of having a universe that sustains life the way we know it, the constants being exactly where they are, in order for that theory to hold any weight, it's just like a deck of cards. The more universes that you have, the possibility of at least one of those universes existing that sustains life with the constants the way they are becomes more probable. So they say there's multi-universes, not multiple galaxies or solar systems, but multiple universes. Okay, that's how they tried to explain the constants where they are in the universe. Now, how would I respond to that? How should we respond as Catholics? Very simply this. Multi-universe theory is highly speculative and cannot be empirically tested. It is only a theory and not provable. The point here being, they tell us that unless you can see, taste, touch, measure, and quantify something, then it's not real. But they propose this theory of multi-universe, where they have multiple universes stacked up on each other, where it cannot be proven at all. In fact, if you look at the literature, Paul Davies, in an article in his book called A Brief History of the Multi-Universe, says this: as one slips down that slope of multi-universe, more and more must be accepted on faith, and less is open to scientific verification. Indeed, invoking an infinity of unseen universes to explain the unusual features of the one we do see is just as ad hoc as invoking an unseen creator. The multi-universe theory may be dressed up in scientific language, but in essence, it requires the same leap in faith. Hello? So believing in multi-universe theory is just like saying that there's a creator. There's no, according to them, there's no way to prove that just using scientific inquiry. So it's just a theory. Also, George Ellis in Scientific American wrote an interesting article called "Does the Multi-Universe Really Exist?" And he says parallel universes may or may not exist. The case is unproved. We're going to have to live with that uncertainty. Nothing is wrong with scientifically based philosophical speculation, which is what multi-universe proposals are. Right? Call it what it is. It's just a theory that's unproven. And according to them, according to their way of thinking, just like they say to us, God can't be proven, but yet their own theories can't be proven as well. Now, multi-universe theory does not explain how things originated in the first place. It does not disprove that there is the possibility of a God. It doesn't do that. And it doesn't even explain why we are here. Next, the atheists propose that morality developed via natural selection and evolution. This is something that's proposed by Sam Harris, the neuroscientist that we talked about before. And here's what he says, very interesting. And where do our notions of right and wrong come from? Well, clearly they've been drummed into us by evolution. So this idea of right and wrong, of morality, it doesn't come from the natural moral law that's imprinted on the hearts of every person by God, but he proposes that this comes through an evolutionary process. He said they're the product of our apish urges and social emotions, and then they get modulated by the culture. So he says questions of right or wrong, good or evil, depends upon minds. They depend upon the possibility of experience. So he talks about our minds are the ones that create these realities, this idea of good and evil, right and wrong. It's not something that comes from God. It's just something that is developed in your mind that comes from this evolutionary process, that comes from these apish urges and becomes modulated by the culture. So what does he mean by that? He says that morality and human values can be understood through science because in talking about these things, we are talking about all the facts that influence the well-being of conscious creatures. In our case, we're talking about, so here's the influences on the mind that influence good and evil, right or wrong. Genetics, again, not natural law, genetics, neurobiology, psychology, sociology, and economics. Those cultural factors, those sociological factors help to form and shape the mind into determining what is right and wrong. Well, okay, what's wrong with that line of thinking? Well, there's two things we can respond to. First of all, how does natural selection explain, as we talked about before, consciousness, conceptual thought, the self, the idea of a free will, the fact that we can make choices based on our experience. So it's not that those things within sociology influence the mind, it's that our minds then have an influence on the culture. So culture since the beginning of time, and anthropologists have studied this, have do's and don'ts. For example, relationships between a marriage, a man and a woman, goes all the way back to, back from the Bible, even before the Bible, thousands and thousands of years, that this was a natural relationship which perpetuated the human race. Now, something can't come from, where did this idea come from? So now they try to say that something now can come from nothing. Two examples. University of Michigan, in a study, said that we can calculate how, from a single electron, several hundred particles can be produced. And it goes on to say that a vacuum, or nothing, in scientific language, a vacuum is nothing, is a combination of matter and antimatter, particles and antiparticles. So in other words, nothing is comprised of something. Matter and antimatter, particles and antiparticles. That's fine. But where did they come from? Things don't come from nothing. Things don't create or make themselves. Or Stephen Hawking says, because there is a law such as gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Okay? So where did gravity come from? See, the whole problem with atheists and these proposals is that they can never go back to a cause that's the root cause for everything that exists. It never gives you a starting point, because it only goes back so far, and then they say, well, we just don't know. Well, we know, right? And Einstein knew. And all those many scientists that made incredible discoveries. Again, what scientific discoveries have they made? What contributions have they made to the field of science and technology? None. Another point, an all-loving God cannot exist, they say, because of the presence of evil and suffering in the world. I mean, look at all the killing that's going on in the name of God and all these different things, murders and rapes and, an all-loving God. Why does he allow that to exist? Again, if you look at evolution, that cannot explain the depth of human evil. Now, it talks about survival of the species. For example, let's use a classical example here. If a lion is hungry and there's a herd of antelope out in the field, and the lion, again, it's a survival instinct, I have to eat in order to survive, that lion is going to go after the antelope. He's going to kill one of them and consume it. It would never cross the lion's mind to wipe out every antelope from the face of the earth. Okay? Now, so evolution cannot explain this really deep desire for evil sometimes in the hearts of human beings. For example, Hitler wiping out over 6 million Jews, or Genghis Khan, or many of the other leaders throughout time in history, in communism. Stalin, for example, killing millions and millions of people. That depth and level of evil cannot be explained through an evolutionary process. And also, they fail to realize that free will can be used for good or for evil. And it's not sociological, economic, or psychological factors. Evil is a weakness, not a power. So how could God allow this, or God created evil? No, God didn't create evil. Evil is a weakness, and God has no weaknesses. It's not a power. It's a weakness that can have power over you. And that's exactly what happens that we see in humanity. We see the depth and the level of sin because evil is a weakness that has overpowered people and allows even great signs of evil to exist in the world. It's sad, but it's a result of free will, not of an evolutionary process. But if we look at the track record then of atheists when it comes to this issue, we'll see something very interesting. For example, Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood, who was an atheist and a eugenicist, said the most serious charge that can be brought against modern benevolence is that it encourages the perpetuation of defectives, delinquents, and dependents, which she defines as people of color and also maybe a child with Down syndrome or some other kind of birth defect. She says these are the most dangerous elements in the world community, the most devastating curse on human progress and expression. Think about that. Human beings made in God's image and likeness are, according to her, a devastating curse on human progress and expression. And she even said in her own documents that she wanted to eliminate, exterminate the black race as if they were vermin. That's the thinking of atheism. What about our friend Peter Singer, who we talked about before, the bioethicist and eugenicist from Princeton University? He says it would be ethically okay to kill 1-year-old children. In fact, he's even extended that now, with physical or mental disabilities, although ideally the question of killing these children should be raised as soon as possible after birth. That's sick. So your child has a birth defect. Well, of course, they're not useful to society. They're a burden on society. Therefore, the right thing to do is to kill them and take their life. That's atheist thinking. He also says that sexual activity between humans and animals that would hurt the animal should be wrong. But that sex with animals does not always involve cruelty and actually can be mutually satisfying. This is just sick. But this is, again, this is the atheist thinking. What about the American Psychological Association that tried to take pedophilia out of its DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, to say that it was not a mental disease? In fact, they say here that no one chooses to be emotionally or sexually attracted to children or adolescents. The cause is unknown. In fact, the development of attraction to adults is not understood. It would seem to me that before you take this definition out and put children in danger, that you would actually take the time to find out and understand what causes that before you say it's not a mental disease. The Catholic response, then, to the atheistic view with regard to human life, has been clear throughout the teaching of the church. I mean, the teaching of the church holds life to be sacred from the moment of conception until natural death. Natalie Hudson has this to say, wonderful response. No human being has the right to decide who shall live and who shall die. The right to life is not something that is given to human being by a government or a judicial body or by an institution of any kind. The right to life is the most basic and fundamental right that exists by the very nature of a human person's being. Why? Because it is given to us by God. God is the author of life. We cannot determine, because someone has a birth defect doesn't make them any less human. Because someone may be a rapist or a killer, yes, what they've done is wrong. We have to judge their actions. But they are still a child of God that deserve our dignity and respect as a human being. And our principle is this: we love everyone, but we always don't love their actions. And we judge actions, we never judge people. All human life is sacred and valuable because it comes from God. We don't think like utilitarianism, where people are only useful, when they can produce something. Our elderly, they are so valuable to us because they are treasures. They are the holders of the traditions. They are the holders of those wonderful recipes that get passed down from generation to generation. They should be not euthanized because they're a burden to their families. They should be cherished and loved as the true treasures that they are. We must not weigh human suffering on the one hand with the value of human life on the other, and determined that some shall live and some shall die, because of the amount of suffering we perceive that they might endure or inflict on others. We exist not to avoid suffering, but to find meaning in the suffering that is unavoidable. I love that. We exist not to avoid suffering, but to find meaning in the suffering that is unavoidable. We must strive for a society that values all human life, does not seek the easy way out through the destruction of innocent life. That is the Catholic response, and that is the Catholic position. So what happens next? So after you make these scientific arguments, then the next thing is they will hit you on history. They'll say things, for example, that religion has slaughtered millions of people in the name of God. For example, look at the Crusades and the Inquisition. Well, let's take a look at that, at the Crusades and the Inquisition quickly. I recommend, however, that you find there's good scholarship that's out there now on the Inquisition and the Crusades. I highly, highly recommend that you go to like Ignatius Press or Catholic Answers publications or Our Sunday Visitor or Institute, and really find good, solid Catholic authors to go much deeper into these issues. But let's take a look at the Crusades and what's happened with the Crusades. The myths around the Crusades and the Inquisition have become very popular. What's called the Black Legend, which has no real interest in facts. It was created to destroy the church's credibility, very much like what happened to Pius XII. Now, Pius XII saved millions of lives, possibly him, and the way he, through the New York Times and others, really was against Hitler and Nazism and really encouraged people to help the Jews. I mean, he himself made Jewish people Swiss guards. He hid people in Castel Gandolfo, the papal retreat. He also forged baptismal certificates. I mean, all kinds of things to save lives. But when the play The Deputy came out by a German named Hochhuth, completely painted Pius XII in a completely different light and discredited him. But during the time of World War II and during the time of the Nazi Germany, you can clearly see that the Pope spoke out forcefully and frequently against Nazism that was going on at that time. So we need to uncover this black legend and get to the truths and the facts about what happened. So first of all, the Crusades, the one first myth is that the Crusades were an unprovoked aggression against the peaceful Muslim world, and nothing could be further from the truth. The fact is, by the time the church got involved, most of the Christian world, North Africa, the Middle East, Asia Minor, and most of Spain, and even parts of Europe, were already overrun by Muslims who were trying to extinguish Christianity. The church got involved as they proceeded through Europe, and in 1095, Pope Urban II responded to a request from the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople to assist them in fighting off the attack. Now, if someone came to attack me and my family, I would defend them with my life. And this is no different than the church trying to defend herself against this attack. It was a defensive war, plain and simple. Another myth, popular myth, is that the Crusaders wore crosses, but they were really interested in capturing land and property and becoming rich off of the plight of others. And that is also not true. Modern scholarship clearly shows has completely exploded this myth. We know now that those who were first called the Crusades, they were simple men. They were farmers and things of that nature. And they were not skilled fighters. They were men just like very much like our soldiers today. They go and they fight, but they want to come home. You don't hear about our soldiers going overseas and raping and pillaging and plundering and wanting to stay there so they can be rich. They want to come home to their families. And it was just no different than the Crusaders back in this time as well. Crusading was an expensive proposition. I mean, they often mortgaged their properties and even ran into great debt. Didn't make any money at all when they came back from these missions. So they did it because of love of the church and a way to serve and help and protect and defend Holy Mother Church. Another popular myth is that the Crusaders captured Jerusalem in 1099. They massacred every man, woman, and child in the city. That's just not true. The fact is worth noting that in many of these Muslim cities that surrendered to the Crusaders, the people were left alone. They retained their property and were allowed to worship freely. That is the fact of the matter. Now, were there abuses in some of these cases? Yes, there were. And for example, some people say that the Crusades were also waged against the Jews, and that is absolutely false. What happened there is that after the First Crusade was called, there was a band of mercenaries that were not associated with the crusading army at all, who on their own, apart from any mandate from the Pope or apart from anything the church was doing, they went into towns in Germany, in the Rhineland, and decided to rob and kill Jews that they found there on their own. This was, again, became part of that black legend. In fact, Pope Urban II strongly condemned these attacks. And actually, St. Bernard put a stop to this when this was going on. So this was nothing that was authorized by the church. So yes, there were abuses that took place. Why? Because we're sinful human beings, and sometimes we do things against the teachings of the church. Slavery is another example of this. Pope after pope after pope openly condemned slavery, even excommunicated anyone that owned slaves. But yet, there were still Catholics that owned slaves and were part of the slave trade. Because sometimes we as Catholics don't want to listen to what Holy Mother Church or the Holy Father has to say. And when those things happen, we have abuses. So the church doesn't back away from them, doesn't shy away from them. We admit that when we make mistakes. And they're documented in many of the church documents that can be found in the Vatican archives and many, many other places. Again, the scholarship that's coming out is showing that all of these black legends are strongly exaggerated things that many of them did not happen at all, or some of them were incidences like this were taken to extrapolate that this is what the Crusades were all about, and that's just not the case. Now, what about the Inquisition? Here's the thing. Back in 1998, Pope John Paul II opened the Vatican archives to about 30 scholars from around the world to study the Inquisition in preparation for the year of Jubilee. So he commissioned this study. I think it took about 5 years for the study to be done. And after 5 years, they came with an 800-page report. 800 pages talking about the church's role in the Inquisition, what the Inquisition was all about. What they found was that torture was rare, and only about 1% of those brought before particularly the Spanish Inquisition, were actually executed. And again, executed they were by the state, not by the church. So let's unpack what the Inquisition was all about. Now, during that time in the church, it was actually against the state law to be a heretic. Because of the relationship between the church and the state, it was actually a capital offense. You could be put to death, punished by death, for being a heretic against the teachings of the church. So what happened back in those days, when someone was accused of heresy, they were brought before a secular court. And the secular court would hear what the offenses were, but because they were not theologians, couldn't always discern the intricacies of what they were hearing, and when this person was preaching heresy against the teachings of the church. So basically what they were doing was putting people to death. The state was putting people to death. So thousands across Europe were being executed by secular authorities without fair trials or competent assessments of the validity of the charges against them. So that's what was happening. So how the church got involved was when the Pope heard that this was happening, he approached the secular authorities and talked about, well, why don't we do these inquisitions? Now, the Inquisition was just the system of government that was in place at the time. It was an inquisitional process of question and answer. And so he said in 1184, Pope Lucius III said, you know what? We're kind of the experts, the church, in matters that to do with heresy. Why don't you let us run these inquisitional courts? And they put the Dominicans there to help in these cases. Let us determine, what's going on here. What was his thought process in this? He thought of himself as a shepherd bringing the lost sheep back into the fold. His purpose was to bring souls back to Christ, back into full communion with the Catholic Church. His idea was to, once the heresy was explained to them, and once they understood where they were wrong, to have them do penance and conversion and penance and bring them back into full communion with the church. That was the idea, to restore themselves back to the body of Christ and back to the church community. Most of the people, this report shows, the 800-page report shows, that most of the people accused of heresy in the Inquisition were acquitted or their sentences were suspended. Those found guilty of grave error were allowed to confess their sins, to do penance, and then be restored back to full communion with the church. The problem is that some of these folks, even after all of that, still insisted in their sin, and they were warned that if you continued in this line of thinking, that the state would still then condemn you to death. See, the church was trying to actually prevent that from happening by having this inquisitional system. And I'll give you the numbers in a few moments. The Inquisition did not burn heretics. It was the secular authorities who did that, not the church. The simple fact is that the Inquisition saved uncounted thousands of innocent and even not so innocent people during the time of the Inquisition. Now, were there abuses that took place? Yes. And again, the church doesn't shy away from that. The report also documents that there were people, because of some collusion between some of the people in the Inquisition system and some people in the government, because of their collaborations. Yes, there were people who did not always get fair trials. Yes, there were some people that were pushed through. Yes, there were some people that the secular authorities didn't like, and there were some agendas there. Yes, there were some abuses that happened. Pope John Paul II acknowledged that these abuses took place, but he did not apologize for the Inquisition because it was designed to save thousands of lives. Again, when people do things that the church does not authorize them to do, when they start to do things on their own, these type of abuses happen. It's happened through all the history of the church, including even in our time, the priest sexual abuse scandal. The church doesn't teach that people should have relationships with children or boys or whatever. But sometimes when you have priests that don't follow the teachings of the church, don't follow what Holy Mother Church teaches, these kinds of things happen. It's not that the church teaches that that's okay, but again, we're sinners. We're in need of God's mercy. And sometimes when people follow their own selves instead of immersing themselves in the life and the teaching of the church, these kinds of abuses will happen, and the church condemns them all throughout the centuries and even to this very day. So let's take a look at the numbers. So let's see what the truth is. The Crusades, you can't find exact figures, but the number that no one will argue with is about 100,000 people died during the Crusades. Let's double it. Let's say 200,000 people died in the in the Crusades. In the Inquisition, there were about 125,000 cases that were investigated, and about 1.8%, or 2,250 people were executed. Again, by the state, not by the church. Because it was, again, it was a capital offense to be an atheist. So you put those together. So 202,250 people died in the Inquisition and in the Crusades if you combine the numbers. 202,250 people. That's a lot of people. Let's take a look at the record of atheism. Atheist communism, Mao Zedong in China killed about 40 million people. Stalin in Russia, at least 20 million people. And if you look at abortion, just the United States, about 55 million people. So we're talking with atheist communism and atheist way of thinking where life is just, your human life is no different than a table or a chair or some inanimate object. We're looking at 85 to over 100 million people killed as a result of the atheist way of thinking. So 202,250, again, that's a lot of people in the Inquisition and the Crusades combined. You compare that with atheist communism, the atheist way, ideology and way of thinking, between 85 and over, at least, these are conservative numbers. Many will argue they're higher than this, but between 85 to 100 million people killed. So, where does this lead us in our faith? If you're standing outside of a museum and you go inside to explore the treasures inside that museum, we don't see the architects who built the building. We don't see the contractors who built it. We don't see the artists that filled that museum with the splendor and the beauty. But we infer that these things were designed and created by someone, huh? And the same is true of God and creation. If Paul were speaking to atheists, what would he say to them today? If we look in Romans chapter 1, verse 20 to 25, what I've done is I've taken the pronoun they that Paul uses and I've put in you, as if Paul were speaking directly to them today. Here's what I think it would say, using, again, Romans chapter 1, verses 20 to 25, substituting they with you. Ever since the creation of the world, the invisible nature, namely his eternal power and deity, has been clearly perceived in the things that have been made. So you are without excuse. Although you knew God, you did not honor him as God and give thanks to him, but you became futile in your thinking, and your senseless minds were darkened. Claiming to be wise, you became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man or birds or animals or reptiles. Huh? This atheist evolutionary way of thinking. Therefore, God gave you up to the lusts of your hearts, to impurity, to the dishonoring of your bodies among yourselves, because you exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator. I think that's exactly how Paul would respond to atheists today. And so one final story. There was a man in my parish, a man and a woman. Now, the woman was Catholic, but she was away from the church for 30 years and was coming back into the church. She brought her fiancé with her. They're both in their 50s, and he was an atheist. So when they came to my RCIA class, he had no interest in coming into the church. He was just there to support his fiancé. And when he would come to class, he would literally sit there and stare at me. So from September, October, November, he would just sit there and just look at me and not say anything for like 3 months. Then we broke for Christmas break. And when we came back in January, he comes up to me, he goes, "Deacon, can I talk to you?" And I'm like, "Oh, you actually want to say something to me now? Okay." And he's looked at me and he says, "I want to be Catholic." I'm like, whoa, time out. You want to be Catholic? You sat here in class for 3 months staring at me, And now all of a sudden you're telling me you want to be Catholic? And he said, he can't make this up. He says this to me. He goes, it's like Tony the Tiger's nose. Now I'm looking at this guy going, okay, look, man, Tony, what does Tony the Tiger have to do with anything we're talking about here? See, he says to me, what color is Tony the Tiger's nose? I say, black. He's a tiger. They have black noses. He says, no, the nose is blue. I said, come on, man. Look, you know how many boxes of Frosted Flakes I ate as a kid? Standing there looking at that cereal box, the nose is black. He says, nope, the nose is blue. And I'm thinking to myself, look, dude, I don't know where you're going with this, but I think you're a little bit nuts, you know? So we go on with the class, and on my way home, I get a call from my wife. Hey, hon, could you stop and, we're out of milk, and can you get a few things and so the kids can make sandwiches for school? I said, absolutely, I'm going to go to the store. First place I go, cereal aisle. And as I go down the cereal aisle, I'm looking, I find the box, Frosted Flakes, and sure enough, that nose is blue. I couldn't believe it. So I see him at church the following Sunday. Obviously, he's not in the church. He's just there accompanying his fiance. And I said, you know what? I owe you an apology, my friend. I would have sworn up and down that that nose was black. But you're right. It was blue. And he looked at me and said, that was my experience with God. He was in front of me the whole time, and I didn't see him. And he talked about how the RCIA class helped him to see God. You see? Because God is a God of truth. Here is someone who did not believe in God. I wasn't trying to convince them through that RCIA class that they should believe in God. But here's the thing. When he heard richness and beauty and truth as presented in the one holy Catholic and apostolic faith, his heart and his mind was attracted to that truth, and in his intellect and in his will and in his heart, he assented to the truth. He was open. Okay, I'm hearing a lot of stuff from this guy. Is anything this guy's saying is true? So he did his own research. He read some things, and he came to the he prayed for the first time, gave it a shot, and came to the conclusion that God is real. And what happened? Well, he came into the church. This guy today is an everyday rosary prayer, everyday mass goer. He built a rosary. He wrote a couple books on the Blessed Virgin Mary. This guy is on fire for his Catholic faith. And because of his witness, both of his daughters also came into the church. You know, he's a wonderful example of men like, Anthony Flew or Albert Einstein. Of course, they became deists, but my friend became a theist, a deep believer in God, who loves the Lord now with all his heart and his mind and his soul. He was open to the truth, and it was the truth that set him free. That's why we cannot be afraid to witness to the beauty and truth of our faith. Not only so much by we say, but by our actions, the way we live, to show people Jesus. That's why at the end of Mass, the deacon dismisses us. Go in peace, glorifying the Lord by your life. Go and announce the gospel of the Lord. Our job is to make the faith come alive in the hearts of the faithful, to show them the beauty and richness and truth of the faith, to not be afraid to tell somebody about the power of Jesus Christ, because you never know how the Holy Spirit will use you as an instrument to bring his love and his truth into somebody's life, just like it did with Dan. Dan had no interest in joining the church. But because he heard the faithful witness, and we have to present that faithful witness just like the martyrs who showed their faithful witness, right? And that's what martyr means witness. These are people who died rather than deny the faith. So, my brothers and sisters in Christ, what is the final analysis of atheism? So I want you to close your eyes for a second. I want you to think of your entire life. I want you to think of the most happy, joyful time you've ever had in your life. I want you to think about maybe something sad that happened to you that brought you sorrow into your life. I want you to think about the people that you love. Atheism is your entire life times 0. Thank you, and God bless.